Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's presentation from the Real Story Group about the right way to select web content management technology in 2019. Appreciate you taking a few moments out of your day to join us. This is Scott Dill on the sales team here with Real Story Group, and our company founder, Tony Byrne, will be joining us momentarily to deliver the heart of today's presentation. But before we really dive into it, I just wanted to mention a couple housekeeping items of note. First, if you have questions at any point during the presentation, there's a questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Please enter your questions in there and we'll get to those as long as time allows at the end of today's session. Also, for those of you that are subscribers, you'll be able to access a recording of today's presentation in about 48 hours in your subscriber library. And for all attendees, we'll be sending out the slides from today's session. So you can look for that from our marketing team over the next couple days. To get started, I wanted to introduce Real Story Group a little bit to you, as it looks like we do have some new faces on the line. And we are an analyst firm. We've been going at this now for 17 plus years. And what we are is a little bit different than other firms that you may be familiar with, mainly because we do no work for the vendors we cover. Okay, so we don't speak at their conferences or write white papers for them or advise them in any way on their strategy. That gives us the ability to really provide a no holds barred type of look at what their products do well, but maybe more importantly for you, where they might fall short in your particular environment. And how we go about that is through our published research, and that's offered in three different ways. First is a self-service subscription where you log in, you have access to evaluations and tools for your selected marketplaces, with the goal being to see your current vendor and how they stack up against other vendors, or potentially create a short list that's based on your specific criteria. If you want some additional guidance, we have advisory services as part of our assisted subscription. You get 4 hours of advisory time per topic that you select, and we can help you to really provide a deep dive analysis on one or two vendors in particular, negotiate your contract, since we work with these vendors all the time, and we're able to know, which modules you need and make sure you're not getting oversold on any particular solution. So that's available as part of our assisted subscription. And then our guided subscription actually also includes some additional advisory time, along with templates such as RFPs and some different artifact reviews that we can perform with you. So we can certainly talk more about that in detail after today's session, if that is something that's of interest to you. But beyond not advising the vendors, we also are unique in that we are completely focused on content-based technology, or put a little bit more broadly, digital workplace and digital marketing technology. Here's our famous vendor map that we have listed here. And what we're going to focus on today is the blue line, so web content and experience management. Like I said, our founder, Tony Byrne, is going to take us through the right way to select that technology in 2019. So Tony, let me hand things over to you.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Scott, and it's great to connect with everyone today. Really exciting times in the web content and experience management marketplace. I've been following this marketplace now for more than 20 years. This light blue line here, web content and experience management, has definitely grown and shrunk, and then grown a little bit over the years. A lot of really interesting trends. It's the first technology that we ever covered back when we were CMS Watch, back before our Real Story Group days, and so it's definitely a topic near and dear to my heart. In fact, I really founded CMS Watch originally based on a magic quadrant, which we're making fun of a little bit here, calling it the mystical quadrant. And I was working at a systems integration firm in the late 90s, and we were implementing version 1 of some CMS tools. And what we were seeing in the top right-hand quadrants and waves was very different than our actual implementation experience. And it got me thinking there had to be a different way of doing this kind of analysis that was a little bit closer to the customer, a little bit more technically detailed, and a lot more harder hitting. And so that's when I founded CMS Watch, now Real Story Group. And you're going to see a little bit later, we've got a kind of a different take on how to do a real quadrant that works for you. So let's just run through the agenda really quickly of what we're going to cover in the next 20 minutes. And as Scott mentioned, feel free to chime in at any time using the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. And we'll definitely have time at the end to pick up on those. But first, we're going to do a quick tour of how do you evaluate WCM tools, and particularly focusing on scenarios and strategic considerations. We'll take a look at the marketplace, which is definitely evolving. And then I'm going to talk about one super important trend for 2019 and 2020 that you really need to think about if you're looking at your WCM investments. And then we'll talk about how to select. First of all, how not to select, and then what's the right way to select a WCM tool. So it's going to be a really fast-paced tour. Strap in and let's get into it. So this is the way that most organizations tend to want to pick technology in general and CMS technology in particular, which is to look at a bunch of features and say, well, does it do this? Does it do that? How does this work? And create these kind of long checklists. So, we focus in our own research on services as well. So here we can see web content management services kind of bucketed into three categories: technology, content, and experience. But the point here is you really want to move beyond checklists, because there are certain times when certain things are going to be more important to you, or even say on that right-hand column on the experience side, maybe you don't even want some of those services at all out of your web content management system. Maybe you're relying quite properly on other services to provide those capabilities. So the point here is that this is an interesting universe of potential features, but it doesn't really always help you as real flesh and blood humans understand, is this system going to work for all of our key personas, most importantly, our prospects and customers who are actually consuming this digital content. So instead, what we encourage you to do is kind of think through what are the key usage scenarios. And we do this across all of the evaluations that we do. So here's an example of kind of 10 key scenarios for web content and experience management. This is our evaluation of the OpenText Team Site product, formerly of Autonomy, and then before that, or HP Autonomy, and then Interwoven. And you can see that it does a decent job of supporting mobile optimized experiences, not so great at some of the other stuff. It's kind of a failing product in the marketplace. But the point here is that you need to understand which sorts of these capabilities are you really focused on. Are you trying, for example, to support a digital workplace? Is multilingual digital really important to you? And maybe it's not. And ideally, you zero in on 2, 3, maybe 4 of these, and then match up against the right vendors to try to understand what is their sweet spot. Of course, vendors, particularly WCM vendors, say, well, we're good at all this stuff. And I'm here to tell you that it's practically impossible to be really good at 3 or 4 of these use cases, because software development is always about trade-offs, right? You're going to sort of emphasize one set of scenarios almost inevitably at the expense of others. But then you also want to look at strategic considerations. And the one that we've learned over the years is critically important is the whole vendor and product ecosystem. This is, in our experience, the best predictor of the longevity of both a commercial product as well as any open source community. This is what really gives the heft and ballast and value to you as a customer above and beyond what the vendor is providing. And this is one of actually 7 to 10 key strategic considerations that we use in our own evaluations, and that I would encourage you to investigate as you do your own vetting. So we look at this in 3 categories: vendor, product, and ecosystem. So in terms of the vendor, you want to look obviously at support, strategy, potentially the vendor's professional services or viability and stability. I can tell you that the customer support is going to vary between bad and really bad, but even then, you want to understand fundamentally just how bad it's going to be. In terms of the product, the really big one there is technical modernity, which is the opposite of technical debt, really important consideration for you. And then, as I mentioned, the all-important ecosystem. We tend to overweight the ecosystem side of this based on our experience. But again, using our tools, you can decide for yourself just how much you want to weight things like community strength, third-party add-ons, channel professional services, and so forth. So what you want to do is look at the intersection of your scenario or functional fitness and technical fitness, and then overall strategic considerations. I'll show you a little bit later how to put those together in a practical way. But the bigger picture here is that this is a highly fragmented marketplace, right? There's a lot of vendors here. We like to categorize them on a complexity spectrum. So the more complex packages on the left, and then the simpler products on the right. This is not a value judgment. In fact, we'll always say if you can get away with something simpler, simpler is always better. This is just sort of an indication of the complexity and therefore likely the total cost of the system as well, and also, the overall richness. So, this is an important spectrum because you need to understand the implications. If you're getting something more platform-like, yeah, it's going to be richer, customizable, probably more extensible, but you're also going to have to deal with more complexity, more developer intensity, and obviously higher long-term costs. So it's important to sort of understand sort of where you fit in on this spectrum. You need to be careful because platforms tend to demo very, very well, but then to actually recreate that slick demo in your environment can take a lot of time and money, and you definitely have a risk of overbuying in this marketplace. So let's go back here and take a look at this. You definitely want to avoid these legacy platforms in the lower left. For the most part, these are systems that people leave rather than adopt. New kind of category that we're looking at this year are platforms that are specific to news media companies as well. And so we're going to be adding those to our formal research. What's interesting is the other vertical that vendors tend to specialize is higher education, and we see that very much in particular down here on the right among the different product vendors. A number of these, including Omni Update, Terminal 4, really have a heavy footprint in higher education. Otherwise, we find in the web content experience management space this so-called horizontal marketplace, which means that vendors tend to focus on every industry segment rather than a particular segment. So again, what you want to do is kind of help yourself sort of understand, roughly where do I fit? It doesn't mean that you only need to look at lower end platforms or only look at mid-range platforms, but you want to kind of have a general sort of environment in terms of the level of complexity that you're going to need before you narrow in further. Okay, so let's also put this in a bigger context here. So this is a traditional marketing engagement reference model. This is an enterprise architecture approach to this challenge of digital engagement and marketing. And you can see web content management is one of the key placeholders here, but you also need to understand how it's going to interact and integrate with your digital asset management, potentially your marketing automation and social engagement services. And then, of course, you want to push out to a variety of different channels, and your web content management system may or may not play a role in that. Obviously, you need to integrate with enterprise data sources as well. And so a key consideration here with any WCM platform is how is it going to play with the rest of my environment? How am I going to plug it in, and how is it going to integrate? Now, many particularly larger web content management vendors will say, well, we can do all this other stuff for you. And I'm here to tell you, you need to be very, very, very careful with that approach. That you really want to do rather than buy a mega suite is to make sure that you're separating your concerns rather than overloading your web content management system with services that it might not be particularly good at. So it's a traditional approach, and obviously you need to think about web content and experience management technology as part of your broader stack. But there's another key trend we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in 2019 and has particular importance on web content and experience management. And this is all about a more omni-channel technology strategy and an omni-channel ready stack. So you see, we still have these engagement channels at the top. You have these interaction and delivery services, and then again, the content and engagement management services in this model as well, including web content experience management. But what we're really focusing on more is this notion of enterprise foundation services. We believe that these are essential if you want to get out of your silos, both your technology silos like web content versus email versus digital asset management, as well as your engagement silos. If you want to get out of those silos and have true omni-channel campaigns and journeys, then you need to focus on these enterprise-wide foundation services, including operations hubs, analytics, customer identity and access management. Over here in the purple, campaign and journey orchestration, customer data platforms, where now we've published the definitive vendor evaluations on those just in the last couple of months. And you see this red, this notion of an analog kind of content platform. It's your base content object store for base stories and assets that you're going to feed across these channels. And we see this as an emerging kind of hub, and your web content experience management vendor may tell you that they can do this. We're actually rather skeptical about that. First of all, because these are likely to be very media centric, and secondly, because they require certain services and the ability to be channel agnostic that traditionally web content management vendors are not so good at. So I think this is an opportunity for you to have kind of a thinner, simpler web content management infrastructure in 2019, and really focusing more on going forward on a kind of an underlying base enterprise-wide digital content platform. So what this means is we think that there's kind of a big rethink coming on web content management, that, your website, and for that matter, even, your mobile web is just another channel, right? And you've got other channels, including applications, and voice and video and others that are increasingly important as well. And so if you're going to do omni-channel engagement, it's going to be pushing decisioning and content lower in the stack. And obviously, this supports growing needs for headless content management and single page application support, but it also narrows the scope for web content management. And the impact here is that your WCM platform going forward may be more of an order taker, not a decision maker. And the content is going to get more componentized and more media heavy in ways that your web content management technology may not be able to support more effectively, and which you may not want it to do. You may want your web content management technology really just to do page and mobile screen assembly for you. So this is a message we've been delivering for 20 years. We'll continue to deliver it even more heavily in 2019, which is don't overbuy. And another way of looking at that is that if we go all the way back to our marketplace here, don't focus on these big name vendors in the upper range platforms. Yes, they've got a lot of mind share, but if you're looking at Acquia, you should also look at more simpler solutions like WordPress. If you're looking at Sitecore, you should definitely look at more simpler solutions like Episerver or Telerik or Kentico. Ditto for Adobe. There are much simpler Java-based platforms out there as well that can give you kind of an Adobe Lite. So don't default to the major vendors. They may leave you sort of too heavy up in your WCM stack when you want to be lighter and more agile there. Okay, so what's the right way to select technology? So the right way to select is really to apply more agile sort of design thinking approach. And we've been helping organizations do this now for the last 18 years. And finally, my colleague, Jared Dingers, and I decided to memorialize all the lessons that we learned in a book that we published last year. You can find it on Amazon or from the publisher, Rosenfeld Media, The Right Way to Select Technology. It's really about taking a more agile approach where you have a team, you put together an interdisciplinary selection team, you test the tools, you iterate that testing, and then you adapt your process. And above all, it's a very human-oriented process to selecting this technology. And it works particularly well for web content experience management, where you have to bring together a variety of different stakeholders, including customer advocates, marketers, UX people, content people, of course, as well as various key IT stakeholders as well. So this is a traditional approach to design thinking where you empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And the way you can do this then is to apply this to a selection process, which is essentially a filtration process. So the first thing you want to do is create diverse user stories. Those user stories could be content contributors and editors, marketers, designers, developers creating new functionality. There's going to be customer journeys in there, obviously. So you want to create these narrative stories, which are really the heart and soul of your selection process. Then you want to get into definitional stage, and so this is creating an RFP and a vendor shortlist. We're big believers in RFPs. You'll see some consultants who are down on them. I think if they're done right, they can be remarkably effective in sharing what it is that you'd like to do and where you'd like to go. Again, stories being the heart and soul of your RFP. Then you're going to ideate by sort of learning about what the market can do and really understanding your own needs better by reviewing proposals and having demos, right? And the demos are always your user stories, not canned demos, right? But then the key phase here is to prototype via hands-on bake-off, right? And so now you've seen your user stories in action, you've modified them, you've learned, and now you actually try them hands-on. We're seeing increasingly, as you get down to a single finalist vendor, then that before you sign a contract, you may also want to do an optional proof of concept, which is to test it out. And we'll often see this with WCM platforms where, okay, I'm down to my finalist, I did a hands-on bake-off, I know I want to go with vendor X, but first I want to test it for potentially for security testing. I may want to do some performance testing. I almost surely want to do some integration testing. And just to reduce my risk, I want to do that before I sign the final contract with that vendor. So let's talk about some of the key points in these in a little bit more detail. First, you want testable narratives. You want actual user stories. Put away Excel. The vendors have seen all of your feature lists. They can check all the boxes. The key question is not what the vendor does, but how they do it, right? And the best way to get to how is to tell actual user stories. We've done dozens of these, if not hundreds, over the years, particularly for web content and experience management. Really lends itself well to this sort of storytelling about what it is that you'd actually like to be able to do with this technology. So these are to-be stories. Now, sometimes if there's certain things that maybe you don't even know that you don't know it, or there's things maybe you could be doing that you don't know about, well, maybe that's a good chance to do an RFI, or request for information, instead of an RFP. The other thing that we'll sometimes do is put an empty story in an RFP. In other words, we'll say, okay, here's scenario 1 through 5 that we'd like to be able to do, but here's an empty scenario 6. You tell us, based on everything else that we shared with you, what's a journey that we could go on with your particular technology that would be really useful that maybe we hadn't thought to ask you. Now, you want to create this RFD or RFP, but then you also want to get to a vendor shortlist. So, we sell research for a living, so we're really big believers in using research among other resources to get there to the right vendor shortlist. Really save yourself a lot of time and make sure that your engagement with the vendors is really productive on both sides, and in particular so that you can use it as a learning process. So it's important to get to the right shortlist. And so obviously you want to use some core filters. These are some of the filters that we have in some of our decision tools and in our research. Regions can matter, whether the vendor is active in your region, and in particular, are there partners active in your region? Licensing models, we're seeing these still converge a little bit, but it may matter to you. Commercial open source, community open source, commercial may have some bearing here. The technologies we're finding, particularly as we move to cloud, that these are less important of a discriminator, but sometimes it may matter to you. My wish for you is that you can be more agnostic about this, but not every organization can. And then the delivery models, the traditional on-premise, different types of cloud become important as well, particularly the different types of cloud. It's important for you to be able to distinguish between something that's multi-tenant software as a service, or perhaps done cloud native, as opposed to platform as a service, where traditional software is basically just being hosted in the cloud. And of course, as I mentioned at the very beginning, don't make the mistake that we all made 18 years ago, which is using some kind of generic quadrant where someone designates a winner and loser. These are a couple screenshots from our real quadrant shortlist generator, where you identify the scenarios that are important to you and you weight those scenarios, and that's the x-axis, and then the y-axis is figuring out the strategic considerations that are important to you, and then weight those. And based on the way that the inputs that you put in, you can get a very different quadrant here. So you have one on the left, and this is for portal use cases where they're emphasizing internal collaboration and lower total cost of ownership, versus the one on the right, different use cases, different enterprise preference with respect to strategic considerations, and you get a very different quadrant. Now, these are portal vendors rather than WCM vendors. WCM lists would be very, very crowded here, as we have like 36 of them, but as you filter down, you can get to the right shortlist and then generate your own custom research and do a deep dive on what are the different pros and cons. The point here is that you don't want to spray the entire marketplace, but you at the same token, don't want to cast too narrow a list as well. So you want to get to sort of like the just right. And hopefully our tools can help you get there. But then the last bit of advice here, and once again, I'll remind you that you can put questions into the GoToWebinar control panel at any time. We'll get to those at the end. The last point that I want to make here is around this hands-on bake-off, because we're just dumbfounded, quite honestly, about how often it is that that companies actually buy software without testing it yourself. It's really important to do this hands-on bake-off. For a WCM platform, you can usually do it for a week per vendor. So if you're doing 2-vendor bake-off, which we recommend, that's 2 weeks of your life. But by the same token, it really helps you understand your own requirements. It really helps you understand which one is a better fit for you. It really helps you get to prototype phase much faster because you've actually been hands-on on the technology. And it gives you a chance, too, to really understand whether the budget you have in place is going to get you where you need to go. So do not skip this step. So here's the key takeaways from the second half of this webinar today, which is you want to take an iterative approach, where initially you start with light requirements, but they're narrative, and you refine them over time as you test at each step of the phase, from the proposals to the demos to the bake-off to potentially a further proof of concepting with just the one finalist. And if we can help you along the way, please feel free to reach out. We've been covering WCM tools now for 18 years. I've been hands-on with them for more than 20 years. You can go to our website and download a free excerpt at any time. And in the meantime, we'll get to your questions here, and I'm going to pull them up here in a second. But Scott, if you want to just wrap up here really quickly for us while I check on our questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, you can go on our website at any time to download not just an excerpt from the web content management research, but feel free to take a look at some of the other areas we cover as well. We recently published new research around the Office 365 suite. Customer data platforms was added to our research a couple months ago. You can also actually try out the tools such as Real Quadrant, real time, so comparing the vendors head to head and creating your own customized shortlist. We're also happy to provide you with a behind the scenes tour of the subscriber experience as well. And if that's something you'd like to schedule, you can reach us at explore@realstorygroup.com. And you can check out the subscription options right on our website as well. So, Tony, I'll kick things back to you. Looks like there may be a question or two here.
Yeah. So Amanda is asking a question that we hear quite frequently in this, which is, where is Microsoft? They're at the center of your map. That's true. What are they doing for web content management? And so I'm just sort of paraphrasing that question, and it's a great question. And the reality is Microsoft is doing essentially zero here. I mean, they more or less gave up on web content management in the 2016 timeframe. Now, it's come back a little bit within SharePoint Online and SharePoint On-Premise in the notion of these sort of hub sites for internal communicators. So if you have a digital workplace use case, SharePoint can play a role there. I think they've given themselves very narrow scope there. I don't think that they would call themselves, even Redmond would not call itself an intranet platform per se, but they do support better publishing options now for corporate communicators, essentially. But if you have sort of broader intranet ambitions, you probably would not want to use SharePoint as your publishing platform. And certainly for external customer-facing sites, Microsoft has completely given up on that. Okay, so Jefferson is asking about DAM and WCM. How should I think about integrating, and should I get them from the same? Can I get my DAM from my WCM? You definitely want to think about integrating. I think you need to be careful about assuming that your web content management platform is going to give you the digital asset management services that you need. It may do a decent job, or maybe even better than decent job, of supporting images that you're publishing on your website. It's unlikely to help you support multi-channel media management or enterprise-wide media management. And for that, you probably need a separate DAM tool. So yes, integrating with a dam becomes an important use case, and certainly one that we encourage people to test in a POC. So with that, we've reached the bottom of the half hour. Wanted to thank you all again for attending. Feel free to check out on our website other forthcoming webinars, and always a pleasure to engage with you. If you have any questions, any other questions at all, feel free to reach us at some of these coordinates. And so for my colleagues, Leanne and Scott, this is Tony Byrne, wishing you a great rest of your week. Bye now.